Okay, so we're going to talk about selection structures and repetition structures, user-defined functions, and these are things that you guys are already familiar with. So this is just going to be, how do you do these things in PHP? Okay. So selection structures, you'll notice there's 4. There's if else, there's a nested if else, and there is a switch. Okay, and those are pretty standard for selection. Okay, so the syntax here is if, and then for your variables, you have to put the $ in front, so that's a little different. But otherwise, the syntax is pretty much the same, right? The line that has the if on it does not have a semicolon. And you only put the semicolons after the action statements. And if you're going to do more than one, you do have to have curly braces. So it is a good habit just to put the curly braces in. Okay, because if you have more than one action statement and you forget the curly braces, it only includes the first one with the if. Okay, so the curly braces just say include everything. This is all part of the if statement. So in addition to an if, you can do an if else. So if you want it to do one thing if it's true, one thing if it's false, then you're going to use the if else. Okay, and this is a pretty standard if else structure. Okay, there's nothing different about the structure in PHP. Okay, so the only thing different about PHP is remembering to put those $ in front of the variable names. To me, that's one of the hardest things to remember. And if I'm going to forget something when I'm coding, it's usually one of those darn $ that I missed on a variable name. Okay? So really your if-else structure is pretty standard. The nested if-else is also a fairly standard structure. So basically you're checking if, and then if it's true, executes. Then it goes down to else if, where there's another condition that it checks. If it's true, it executes. Then it goes down to else if, and it keeps kind of going through the structure. If everything is false, it gets down to the final else, and it executes. What? Yes, I know. I didn't want to say they failed. I was trying to be nice. Please get help. The switch statement. Actually, I like the switch statement. It's one of my favorite structures. It's often used in menus. And you're going to switch on a variable. And the variable that can be a number, it can be text. Okay? But you're going to switch on one variable. Then you have your case statements where you're checking to see if that is the variable. And if that's true, you've got code you're going to execute. Probably the most important thing is that you remember the break statement, because once a case tests true, that flag is on. And if you forget break, it's just going to execute all the code from that point down. Okay, because once it sets to true, it's set. Okay, so you need to break out of there or you're going to get everything executed. Okay, so that's probably the most important thing.
Well, are there ever situations where you don't want to put break?
No, not in a switch. No. And if you have a situation maybe, and I put that example down here. So I have a couple examples. This one is switching on strings. Okay, and usually with the switch you do set a default, so it's kind of a fall through. So if none of the cases are true, okay, then it goes to default. And this is why it works really good in a menu, because like if you're telling them to pick something from a menu and they miss key, then it goes to the default, tells them that their selection was invalid and they need to pick again.
And here you don't get a break for the default?
No, because the default's at the bottom. If you want to use the same actions for multiple values. Then you can kind of string those cases together. Okay, so here I've got, these are numeric, but they could be text also. I've got case 1, case 2, and case 3. So if the department is a 1, 2, or a 3, then they're management, basically. Okay? If the department is a 4 or a 5, they work in the warehouse. Okay? If the department is a 6, 7, or an 8, they're in sales and marketing. Okay? So here I've got multiple values for each case. But you will notice that each one has a break. And then for the default, your department does not exist. So, rather than, come on, pick a valid department. Yeah, go see tutoring. Okay, so those are selection structures, and that should be somewhat familiar to you guys. Okay, we also have repetition structures. So there's while, do while, for, and those are pretty standard. And then there's also for each, okay, which is also becoming a pretty standard loop. Okay, so with a while loop, you're just checking a condition and you're going to stay in the loop as long as it tests true. And so usually at the bottom of the loop, if it's a counter that you're checking, you increment the counter. Or if the user has to key in something to get out of the loop, you know, do you want to continue, yes or no? Then you pull in that value. Okay, so at the bottom is where you are changing the value that is being tested, so that when it comes back up, it can test false. If you forget to change the value, you are in an infinite loop, which can be quite exciting. I like infinite loops. I think they're funny. People's screen will just start flashing. I'm like, oh, you're in an infinite loop. We've got a little example here. This is a counter. Okay, and you'll notice I am incrementing the counter, so eventually that will test false. The difference between a while loop and a do while loop. With a while loop, you are testing the condition before you go into the loop, so it is possible that the condition is going to be false, in which case you never get into the loop. With a do while loop, you always go through at least once, because the condition is not checked until the bottom. Okay, so this is basically the same example with the counter, but we're automatically going to go through once. Okay, so if you want to force people into, force them into the loop, then you want a do while. For loops, I typically use those for array processing, because you know how long the array is, because there's a length property that you can use. And so for loop works great because you can use a counter, and you typically initialize it, and then you check the counter to make sure that it's less than the length of your array. And then each time you go through, you just add one to the counter. Okay, so for arrays, it works great. Okay, and anytime you know exactly how many times you want to go through, it works well. Oh, I see. I even proofread this, and I misspelled continue. So that is continue, not continue. Continue and break. And so basically, both of them are used to get out of loops or skip over code. The difference, if you use a break, it actually exits the entire loop and goes to the statement below. And if you use continue, what happens is if you're in a loop, from the point you have continue down, it skips the code and it starts over at the top. Okay, so continue goes back to the top, break takes you out. Okay?
No matter what.
Yeah, break will take you out. Yep. Looping errors. The only time I've encountered looping errors, and I actually don't get these because I'm going to tell you a trick to avoid them, is basically you either forget to increment the counter, in which case you get an infinite loop, or you get what's called off by 1. So if you initialize a counter to 0, in your conditional check, you need to use less than. Okay? And then you're going to be okay. Okay? Because you're starting at 0. If you initialize to 1, then you're going to want to use less than or equal to. Okay? And then if you do that, you're not going to have the off by 1 error. Right? Because if you start at 0 and you wanted to go through 10 times, okay, then you want less than 10, because you're going to go 0 through 9, and then you're going to be done. If you started at 0 and you did less than or equal to 10, then you end up going through 11 times. Okay, so that's kind of my helpful hint. And what I usually do is, unless there's a reason for me to initialize to 1, I pretty much initialize to 0, and I use less than. Okay, and I pretty much code the same way no matter what language I'm in. Okay, because that way I don't have to think too hard. Okay, it's just a standard that I use, and it works. Okay. Another error that people will do is they will put a semicolon at the end of the for or the while statement. So they put a semicolon here after the conditional checks. If you do that, you basically have what I call a do-nothing loop. Okay? It doesn't loop through the code below. It just loops through itself. So it does nothing. Okay? And then once it's done doing nothing, it's going to execute the code below one time. So it's not going to do what you want it to do. And then the last error that I see is that they have multiple commands and forget to put them in curly braces. And you can avoid that problem by always using the curly braces, whether you have one command or more than one. So if you get in that habit of always using them, you're not going to have that problem. You guys have any questions so far? This is all pretty much review, right? Okay. User-defined functions. So these are functions that you guys create yourself. PHP allows it, and it also has over 1,000 functions that are defined in the program itself. So basically, how I determine if I need to create a function is if I've written code and I've noticed that I've got like the same section of code appearing in more than one place. Okay? When that happens, you should pull it out, throw it into a function. It's more efficient. A function should only do one thing, should perform one task. Okay? So that would be an example of kind of cleaning up your code, okay, and functionalizing it. Yep, so the question is, so it's kind of like a method. It is kind of like a method, but the difference between a function and a method is that if it's a method, it's part of a class. And you have to have a class object calling it. So you have a class object and a dot, and then the name of the method. And with a function, all you have is the name of the function. Okay, that's the difference. That's how you can tell. I mean, even if you are new to the language, if you see what you think is a variable and a dot and, you know, a name of a routine, okay, you've got a method. Okay, if it's a name of a routine followed by parentheses, I should qualify that, because methods and functions have to have parentheses. Okay, and if you just see the name with the parentheses, nothing in front of it, you got a function. Okay, so that's how you can tell. if you've got like what you think is a variable name, a dot, and another variable with no parentheses, that's a property. So it's also part of a class. Does that make sense? Yes, no, yeah. Okay. Okay. A lot of people get very confused about, you know, what's a property, what's a method, what's a function. Okay. So anything that's part of a class, properties and methods, have to have objects. Let's see. So you have to have an explicit call to the function in order for you to use it. Function names are not case sensitive, but they should start with a letter or an underscore and not a number. What do I start my functions with? I always start them with a letter. Okay, that's just how I name stuff. When you create a function, you can doesn't have any parameters. You still have to have the left and the right parenthesis. Okay, that's required, even if you're not sending it any information. Okay, so the way you create it is you use the keyword function, space, whatever you want to call your function, left and right parenthesis. Then you'll notice we have curly braces, and inside you've got your code that needs to be executed. So I have a super easy example. I think we looked at this last week where we have a constant called chocolate that we're defining. And yes, and you'll notice I put true on the end, so it's not case sensitive. And then I have a little function called yum. And then below, this is my call to the function. So I've just got the name yum with the left and right parenthesis. That calls the function. And basically, it's going to print out Toblerone is my favorite chocolate. And then it does a line break, and then it prints it out again. A very useful function. Okay, so this is an example of a function with no arguments. There's no parameters. A function that has arguments or parameters, here's an example. So in the parentheses, you do have a variable. Okay, and so it's kind of the same example. In the function itself, when we pull that data in, we are going to refer to it as favorite. That is the name we are giving it inside the function. You can see we're calling it twice. So the first time through, prints it, and then it does it the second time as well. Does that make sense? So that was one argument. You can also have multiple arguments. And if you have multiple arguments, they are positional. So here I've got a student function. And you can see I'm creating two Scooby-Doo characters. And so when they come into the function, first argument is name, then we've got major, then we've got GPA. Okay, so Scooby-Doo will be name, forensics major. He needs to work on his GPA. He's got a 1.5. For a dog, yeah. Especially because he can't talk very well, ruh-roh. So that comes in as GPA, and then basically it's just printing out some information. Okay, and then basically we're calling that same function with different data. And you can hard code data like this, or you can send it variables, either one. Let's see. So you guys have probably heard the term argument and parameter, and basically they are kind of interchangeable. But technically, when you call a function, you are passing arguments. Okay? And then when you are bringing the data into the function, you're bringing in parameters. And why they named it differently, I do not know. If it was up to me, I would just call them all the same thing. Okay? But that's why they are interchangeable. Okay? But technically, when you're calling the function, it is an argument. You can have default values on your functions. And this would come into effect if they did not pass hours or rate. Okay? So if you set them equal to a value and you call the function, and there's nothing entered for hours or rate, those become the values. Okay, so for Scooby, his hours would be 40 and the rate would be 13 because they are not being included. For Thelma, you can see that we did include hours and rate. Okay, so those will be used instead of the defaults. And I would set defaults if I was afraid that people weren't going to send me all the data. Then we also have functions that return date or return values. So when you call these functions, you need some kind of an assignment statement, okay? Or they might be part of a print statement, okay? So this example that I have, so if it returns a value, you're going to have a return statement, okay? And in this little example, we're basically sending it to numbers, we're adding them together, and it's returning the sum, okay? In here, you can see this is where it's calling the function. This is where the sum is going to be returned. And because it's part of an echo statement, it just prints it out. Here's another example where it is calculating the total pay. Okay, so in the function pay rate, we're figuring out what the total pay is, and it's returning that value. And so here, we are calling pay rate, and then you can see that we're storing it in a variable called pay. So that would be the other way of handling return values, okay, where you store the value and then you can see that we're printing it out here. Makes sense, right? You guys have any questions? Okay, so I knew this was going to be pretty quick because this is kind of a review. So I'm going to move on to the assignments. Let me stop this.